Thank you for coming to today's live stream Q&A. Feel free to drop your comments, your questions into the comment section, and I'll gladly answer them. How do you write a slow burn romance? The main piece of advice I would give for writing a slow burn romance is remember that where like obviously a faster romance has people jumping from emotional state to emotional state quite quickly, or even the feelings of the characters are pretty fully realized much more quickly. This really is a game of baby steps. Like it's not a matter of them going from hating each other to liking each other in a step. It is going from them like hating each other, for example, to hating each other a little bit less. Maybe they start to see some kind of value in the other person. And it's a very slow step-by-step progression. And so if you want to be real slow burn, you're basically giving little victories continuously throughout the story that build upon each other to eventually reach the payoff at the end. And you can also work in some backtracking. For example, maybe they start to like each other and maybe they seem to be on their way to finally expressing their love for each other. But then one of them does something that really angers the other one, really hurts the other one. And then they're back to not square one because their context of the relationship has completely changed, but they're knocked back quite a bit. And then it's about building back up again. Basically, it's all about, you can have big jumps back, but only ever small steps forward is a good way to look at slow burn romance. How do you convey an unreliable narrator when they're the only point of view in the story? There's a few different ways you can do it. One way you can do it is you can have the character be, because there's different ways that a character can be unreliable. So for example, a character can be unreliable if they're a very boastful personality who's very invested in their self-image. So if that's your character and you want to show them being unreliable that way, well, you show it by having the personality on the page be that way, having them talking themselves up really big and like minimizing their defeats or glossing over it, even when other characters in the story kind of bring them up. Maybe the character gets defensive in the narration when people bring up their flaws. And maybe like the things they claim they do, the narrator claims they do, are just a little hard to believe because they seem a little extravagant for what we know about the character. And so those are ways you can convey that. You could also have another common one is, let's say your main narrator is a child and they are very naive. And so they might see, two adults going in another room as them, like the narrator would interpret, oh, they go in there and they wrestle. They wrestle once a week. That's their naivety getting in the way of the correct interpretation. But the reader knows what those adults are doing in there. So that's another way you can do it. You can also incorporate discrepancies in their stories. They could say one thing or interpret something one way, but then another character in the story is saying something through dialogue that kind of paints things in another way. And so that can start to pick apart the narrator's reliability. If you want examples of this and a great model to follow, I recommend Kazuo Ishiguro. I recommend him pretty often. He is, I like him a lot. He is, I would say, the king of the unreliable narrator, and his stories are just fantastic in terms of narrators who see the world in a very particular way, and they miss some truth. For example, his most famous, and I would say his best novel, The Remains of the Day, is from the perspective of a butler in England around the 1950s, though the timeline goes back into the earlier 1900s. And the butler is very invested in the idea that he served a great man during most of his career. But as the story progresses, even though he has a high opinion of his employer, you start to see terrible things that this employer was a part of or believed, and the butler kind of like defends him in those, so you can really tell what else isn't he telling us. And so, yeah, Kazuo Ishiguro is a great person to look at as a model. Is it bad if my writing was described as cinematic if I'm trying to write a novel? No, it's great. It's just a visual style of writing. People say cinematic as a metaphor for what you're doing. People describe my writing as very cinematic just because it's very visually engaging. What I will say is cinematic is neither good nor bad. It simply is a descriptor, and some people love it, some people don't. That's true for any style. Very minimalist writers would never be described as cinematic, but a lot of people really love that more minimalist style as well. So all it means is you're having a particular style emerge, and that's good. Why do I hate what I write? So when you look at your own writing and you think to yourself, this is terrible, I hate it, a lot of that comes from, I would say, two different places. First, you are hyper-focusing on what's wrong with the story, because you have not learned to focus on what's going well. We learn from in school and everything we do, we often learn to pick things apart more than we learn to build them up and spot little pieces of potential, little things we're doing well, especially in our own writing. Like think of a writing class you took in high school or college. When you write your first draft and then you hand it to your teacher or your students or your fellow students for feedback, and the feedback tends to be more of like what's wrong, what can be made better, and stuff like that. There less often a good teacher will do this and a good reviewer will do this, but they tell you what's working and how to bring that out. That's how it should be framed. And so we are taught to look at what's wrong with the story, not what's good. And so what I encourage you to do, first of all, is to try and look deeper into your story and find the things that are going well and focus on the things that are going well. So that's one thing I would say. The second reason you might hate your story is you're thinking of your story as too much of an early draft in particular, and not like a later draft. So like your first draft, it's easy to hate on it because it's very rough. And when you're hyper-focused on, once again, things that are going wrong instead of what's going well, and when you're hyper-focused on polish level things that should be left for later, like grammar and the perfect phrasing and the right word, when you hyper-focus on that, it makes it easier to hate on the rough draft because you're judging it as if it should be a final finished product. You're judging it like a book off your shelf, which you shouldn't do with a rough draft at all. And you should save that polish for later. So that might be another reason you're disliking it. How would you write 2 points of view? Would you separate them by chapters or make them different and into other sections? Chapters is one, so you can do both ways. You could have it either alternating every chapter or every few chapters. You could have it switch perspectives. That's a very common way to do it, an acceptable way to do it. If you want, but you can also have the different perspectives be in their own sections of the novels. The difference between the two from an experience standpoint is when you have it alternating in chapters from chapter to chapter, it definitely feels like we're telling a concurrent story. Everything's moving forward together and it's kind of tightly weaving the two together. Whereas when you have them divided into their own parts, it's much more like so-and-so takes the first chunk of the story and it's almost like a baton pass, and it kind of chunks the different perspectives together more. And it's, instead of experiencing the full story moving forward from all these different perspectives, instead it's like, well, this part of the story is from this one, this part of the story is from another person's perspective. And so it's just kind of a different experience. Do you think it could be feasible to have two equally important protagonists? Yep, absolutely. I would just say it really helps to, if their relationship in particular, because it's good to have some kind of a focal point, and if they're completely unrelated characters, then it could be a little difficult. But if they have a relationship, if they're rivals, for example, or if we're all leaning toward, if the whole story is moving towards them eventually clashing, then we can at least see the focal point of them coming together as something to focus on in the story. So that can be a good time to do that for sure, but it's definitely possible. How do you untangle your main plot when you have many ideas but they don't align? I would say what you want to do, if you have a lot of different plot elements, a lot of different plot ideas, but none of them kind of fit in a clear pattern, what you want to do is look for the through line. And what I mean by that is look for a pattern in the plot, or a path through those different ideas that includes as many of those ideas as possible, but it won't necessarily include all of them. And the ones where it doesn't pass through, cut them. If you can't find a way to connect them all, then that means some of the outliers will need to go, and that will leave you with the ones that are relevant enough to tie together for your story. So that's what I would say is look for a through line that connects as many of those plot ideas as possible. And then for those that don't fit, feel free to cut them. And then I would also say, when you're trying to connect those different ideas, don't try to think of it as like, what are the big, like, how do I go from A to B, B to C, like each of those steps. Like, look at smaller, like, yeah, let's use numbers. Let's say it's step 1 to step 2 to step 3. Don't think step 1 to step 2. Think step 1, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and just take steps in the direction of the next plot point. And it'll be easier to find your way there because you're not thinking of the big jump, you're thinking of just little steps in the right direction. And so that can help a little bit as well. How do you know when you've used enough description? I'm either in one extreme or the other. How do you balance it? So first of all, this is one of the reasons why reading is so important for writing development, is because developing a taste for what feels appropriate for your story comes a lot from looking at other writers, seeing what they've done, and really just over time reading more and more of it so you get a taste for it and a felt sense for it. And then obviously practicing with your own work, and that helps as well. And so I would encourage you to keep reading and keep writing, so that will help a little bit. Now, for more tangible advice to help you kind of in the moment is like, how do you know when there's enough? The truth is, there is no right or wrong answer. There are some writers who write just a lot of description in their stories and really fill it. And there are others who write very little. And the difference is they have different aesthetics of a writer, and they developed their aesthetic as a writer. And some readers will hate writer A's style because it's too dense. For example, I love Stephen King. He writes very dense prose. A lot of people also don't, because they think it's too slow. It's too dense. They don't like it, where it immerses me in a great way. Other writers will write more minimally, and some readers love that, and some readers hate it. So there is no objective answer to what's the right balance, and that's why, once again, it's important to like really explore what's the right balance for you by figuring out what you like and reading, practicing, and that's how you can really develop that felt sense once again. Now, a more technical answer might be the right amount of description is the minimal amount to convey what you want to convey. And once again, you can answer that in many different ways. One writer might interpret that as, I really want to make use of my imagery to convey this level of characterization, this level of immersion, and bring this character to life in this way. Whereas another writer might say, well, I want to convey more of the story through like dialogue and brief character actions. I don't want to use the tool of description that way, and they don't have to. But so I would say for you, first drafts, as always, use your gut. Second drafts, then look at it with clear eyes after you've let it sit for a while and see what feels right to you. Really lean into that felt sense that you have developed and you are developing. If I know a character is useless, how do I get rid of them? In draft 2, you cut them out, and whatever minimal purpose they served originally, have other characters take over that purpose. A good technique for this is called character folding. At least that's the term that Rebecca Mackay, the author, uses. And it basically means if you have characters that aren't necessary to the story, but maybe they serve like one or two small key purposes, and you do need someone to fulfill that, it's good just to fold those characters together, because it actually can help complexify the characters as well, because you add more dimensions to them because they fulfill more relationship roles, for example, with the main character, or serve more purposes in a story. So that's what I would recommend. Fold that character's purpose into another character. How do you develop your characters correctly? So if you're trying to do character development, it really helps to first start with thinking of it as, what state is my character currently in? What state do I want them to be in? And what steps do I take then to get them there? And you can think this out beforehand if you're a plotter who likes to plot every little piece. Or if you're more of an improviser, you can think to yourself, all right, this is where my character is. This is where I want them to go. With each event, I'm going to drive them one step closer in that direction until I get there. And so those are the two different ways you can kind of approach it. Does every character need to have development? No. The characters need to be developed enough to serve the purposes of the story. And so, like, if it's a side character that no one's invested in and doesn't really serve a big role of the plot, you don't need to have them go on this big character journey or character arc. If you gave every character in your story an arc, it would be so convoluted. It'd be about characters probably people don't care too much about. So when you're trying to figure out which characters to develop, think of it as the more prominent they are in the story and the bigger actors they are in the story, the more you'll want to develop them. So, for example, if you have some characters that are basically main characters, like they are really deeply involved in the story, you might want to give them a little bit of an arc, some growth. And even before the growth happens, show like different sides to them to really develop them. But if a character's only there for a few scenes, we don't need to know their whole life. We don't need to see them go on a big arc. It's okay to develop them very minimally. What's some advice you have for new writers? For new writers, the things I like to tell new writers is, first of all, to grow as a writer, the most important things to do are 1, to read, and 2, to write. Those two things you have to do if you want to improve in an efficient way. So reading and writing will always be the most important things you can do to improve as a writer, because what you're doing is you're filling your mind with examples of writing. You are getting a taste for what works, for what doesn't. You're studying the books as you're reading them, and you're getting inspiration from those books. And then what writing is you're practicing what you're seeing. You're trying on different hats stylistically. Emulating writers is totally okay. Definitely look at writers you love and try to emulate them, try to learn from them, and you'll grow a lot more quickly. So those are the two things I say. First of all, read, write, emulate. That's all good, and that's going to be the most important stuff you can do to grow as a writer. Then on top of that, you have writing advice. Things like my videos, things like books on writing, like Stephen King's on writing, which is fantastic. And writing advice should only ever enrich those other efforts. So once again, reading and writing and emulating are the most important things you can do. And writing advice should just enrich those efforts. They should guide those efforts, but it should never be a primary pillar on its own. So that's something I would tell you. So I'm basically telling you that what I do here is not as important as what you do with reading and writing and practicing.